Hyvää iltaa. Thank you very much for coming for this topic that is a topic I've been researching for quite a long time now, not specifically in the Finnish context, but in general. And this seemed to be the perfect opportunity to talk about Art Nouveau, and how maybe Finland and Finnish Art Nouveau integrates the general worldwide scene. Why this Paris Art Nouveau at the World's Fair? Because today we sort of forget the importance of World's Fairs in the past. There used to be congregations where people from all countries and nations would build pavilions, would show the best of what they had, the most modern, the newest technology, the newest culture, the newest art. It was a way of showing off and also exchanging, but it also had cultural undercurrents, artistic undercurrents, political undercurrents, which is something that we don't often talk about when we read about Art Nouveau. The political side is often quite forgotten because, like in places where I'm from, Art Nouveau is more aesthetic, it's more industrial, commercial, not so much political. And the first time I came to Finland, which was more than 10 years ago, I was really surprised to see how much Art Nouveau there was here, because of course maybe in other countries it's not so well known, and also what a message there is, and how there's something totally different that is told in the story of Finnish and Helsinki Art Nouveau, which I think this is a good opportunity to sort of go to Paris together and talk about Art Nouveau at this World's Fair, which is a very interesting topic in itself, because Art Nouveau has all sorts of different facets, so we'll only talk about specific parts of this World Fair. But I think what's really important also is that the Finnish pavilion at this World's Fair is the one that really sort of put Finland on the map for many people who knew nothing about Finland at the time. It was really recognized as an artistic wonder. It's one of the most interesting pavilions of the fair. And of course, it launched the career of various architects, and also sort of brought the world opinion onto it brought Finland onto the stage and sort of shared its, sorry, I'm losing my words, it shared its political situation and context, which of course you all know. So my idea today is not to go through the whole fair together, but it is to just sort of touch on various topics, including Finland. So it's not specifically based on Finland, but this will give you the basic idea on how Art Nouveau was in the world at that point in 1900. So just to make sure we have a proper context, for those who may not be quite as familiar with the precepts of Art Nouveau, I've chosen a couple of the major architects just to say these are the fundamentals of Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was an artistic current at the end of the 19th century, which really came from a desire to rupture with past tendencies, create a new style of beauty, something more original, something that would be true to the age, that would take into consideration modern technology, modern technique, but also which would somehow go back to nature. There's always this conflicting, sorry, my original language is French, so it's sort of translating in my mind, I'm sorry. Basically, it puts into consideration how you can put modernity with going back to vernacular constructions. And so, for example, you have Victor Horta, who uses glass, who uses metal, which are totally modern, but who integrates into his art flowers, stylized motifs from animals and plants. And here you have the Hôtel Tassel, which is considered to be the first Art Nouveau building in the world, which dates from 1893, and the Hôtel Van het Velde, which is also in Brussels. So Horta was a pioneer, and if you actually get to visit these buildings, it's totally spectacular because you can tell how radically different it is from anything that was built at the time, especially with this quest for light and this omnipresence of decoration. And here, you see this whiplash line, that's what you're looking for. In this kind of Art Nouveau, it's like if you imagine the whip, you have the curve and then the curve that goes the other side. It got to the point where people who made fun of Art Nouveau called this the spaghetti style because it was like a whole lot of spaghetti that some countries or some critics considered to be much too over the top. Alphonse Mucha, who was also in Paris, is one of the most probably well-known artists of this era. I think everybody must recognize these from biscuit boxes and all kinds of souvenirs. He was originally from the Czech Republic, but he came to work in Paris, and he became hugely famous. People loved his creations, and he was sort of sought after by everybody, including for this 1900 World Fair. And again, so you see this very flamboyant, flowing lines, hair, dresses, curves, flowers. This is a very flowing, floral, sinuous Art Nouveau, which is more specific to Belgium, France, some parts of Switzerland, and which would not be so much what you would find in Austria, in Germany, in Finland. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, this is exactly to show the other side of Art Nouveau, which is more like what you'd find in Finland. So Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who was from Scotland, created some beautiful works, especially in Glasgow. Here you have Hill House in Helensburgh. And what's interesting is Finnish architects also sought inspiration in America and then in England for what was happening at the time, especially this, this use of rough stone, which you find a lot here in Helsinki, and which is something that's considered to hark back to medieval times, baronial architecture. So how interesting that you could go from this sort of like castle-like exterior to the inside, which is very delicately decorated. So these are some of the huge names of Art Nouveau that everybody at the time would have been familiar with in the world of architecture. And coming to Helsinki Art Nouveau, to just show this maybe some of the big buildings. So everybody knows the Pohjolan Toimitalo, which was also designed by Gazelius, Lindgren, and Saarinen. It is one of the major, they were building this building, which is on Aleksantterinkatu, at the time of the project for the pavilion. So they were starting to make their mark. They had won the competition for the facade, this facade that was made of soapstone, which was a soft stone that you can carve. So this is something that was quite new, not totally new. There already had been some examples in the previous years, but this is something that was becoming in Finland's part of what was considered to be the national art. And of course, this is probably what also helped Saarinen, Lindgren, and Gazelius get the job for the pavilion. This is one of my favorite buildings here. This is just to show you again, you see this, this is in Kronenhaka, and it's a school. And of course, for when you come from France or somewhere else, this kind of massiveness is not something you'd ever see in Art Nouveau. And of course, the animals, which is something very specific to Finnish architecture, I think more so than in many other places. And some last examples, just to give those who are not so familiar with local architecture here, some good examples of what you'd find. And of course, the main thing is this idea of stylization. You do not reproduce what you see in nature. You take the essence and create it into something new, a new motif that could be basically reproduced to make friezes, patterns, decorations, carpets, whatever. So let's go to Paris. And here you have the basic plan. And you see that along the Seine, which is where all the pavilions of the nations were in a row. And over there you had various elements. So it was a huge section that took many months to build. Many people were complaining that even when it opened, many of the pavilions were not finished. It lasted for 6 months. And of course, it had a huge amount of visitors, being almost 48 million visitors, almost 50, let's say. And what was special about this one is that it was the first fair of the millennium. So of course, various countries had vied to have it in their own country, and especially Germany. Germany had sort of lost their chance, but they had initially said they were interested. And of course, Paris, France, and Germany at the time were vying for cultural preeminence, for industrial preeminence. Germany was one of these up-and-coming countries at the time. It was also Japan. So there was all these things happening at the time, and all the countries were sort of fighting for their place. And hosting this World Fair was also a sign of France being still, as they would see it, at the top of the world, which is very much in all the documentation that you find on the topic. So, bienvenue à Paris. If you arrived at the Paris World Fair, you would meet the Porte Binet, the Porte Monumentale, the monumental gate, which at the time was considered one of the most Art Nouveau buildings at the fair, which is actually quite surprising because for us, with our standards, this is not Art Nouveau. This has very many oriental influences. It has all kinds of allusions to other styles, but it was considered modern style. And this is also something that's quite interesting, is that in 1900, Art Nouveau hadn't been around for that long, and it was still being defined. And it was, so you see these random definitions, and people say, oh, this is that. And because of course Art Nouveau became sort of more generalized after the World Fair, because you could say both that this fair is what made Art Nouveau worldly famous, but maybe at the same time you could say that this was the pinnacle of this huge international movement, and that after this it also started to go down. So there are conflicting opinions, and it's also something quite interesting. And in my view, for me personally, this Exposition Universelle is really something where you discover it. You can walk through this expo, you can see it everywhere, in every single bit of the fair. And of course, what's interesting is that not only is it in the architecture, we won't talk about this much, but even the pavilions that didn't have any Art Nouveau, you can be sure that in the interiors, if it's industrial, they would have had elements with Art Nouveau, because it's not that Art Nouveau became the only art of the time. Eclecticism, historicism was going on. So you'd go in a fair, in a stand, and you'd have however many objects. And among those objects, you'd have Art Nouveau objects because they were popular. They were fashionable. So that's something that I won't really touch on much today, this sort of standardized industrial commercial aspect, but it's to be remembered. So the Porte Binet could have been this, because when they announced they were going to have the fair in Paris, there was this idea that they had to create something that was fabulous, much more fabulous than the Tour Eiffel. The Tour Eiffel, which had been the monument, the symbol of the 1889 fair in Paris, which had, of course, marked the end of the century. And so people started sending in all sorts of propositions for how they could decorate the Tour Eiffel, clad it with bits and bobs, in some styles, other styles. So everybody had crazy ideas, which apparently were all rather terrible in the eyes of the organizers. And one that I think is quite interesting is this Pavillon de l'Homme, which is by Alphonse Murat, which we met earlier on. And he, of course, takes his very Art Nouveau style. This is like, if this had been built, this would have been definitely the most blatantly Art Nouveau building of the place. And it's, of course, also something that's meant to show the future, the optimism of man, something very linked to industry, like progress. So it sort of encompassed the idea of the time, but it was not considered possible or sufficiently glorious. So in the end, instead of choosing one great monument like the Tour Eiffel, they decided that they would have more than one construction of importance, which was with the Porte Binet in particular. And what I like very much with this Porte Binet is that though it's not, in my eyes, very Art Nouveau, I do like the way people considered it as something completely fascinating and new. But of course, a lot of people didn't like it at all and criticized this new style, which was totally incomprehensible. And one thing that I think is also important to keep in mind for this exhibition is that this was the advent of electricity. Electricity had been around for a while, and Paris, the Ville Lumière, the City of Light, wanted to promote electricity as much as possible. And they're sort of showing this in some fantastic, modern, progress, forward-thinking way, when in fact, I've read articles that say that they were not selling enough electricity at the time because people were still rather hesitant, a little bit scared. And so this was a way also of pushing visitors to discover what was possible with electricity. And so this Porte Binet, for example, had thousands of glass cabochons, so glass pieces which had lights in them. So at night it would be totally lit up in all these different colors, which of course would have added to the spectacle this idea of modernity, something different. So here is the pavilion at night, looking very amazing. And here is the Parisienne. So you could see this as the new Marianne. She is not exactly Art Nouveau, but she's sort of getting there. And she was considered to be the new symbol, the symbol of Paris. Before you would have had Marianne, you know, the revolutionary Marianne. And now Paris wants to create this picture of the supremacy of Paris. Paris represents France. La Parisienne is the woman of taste, the woman for which all the luxury goods that are being produced are being sold to. And she becomes the new emblem. She's laughed at by most critics who decidedly hate her. They call her atrocious, scandalous, and of course she has these clothes which were actually designed by an haute couture house called Jeanne Paquin. So she has a fur trimming, velvet dresses, and so something interesting on the political side, though, is that France was trying to create stability between all the different political parties. They did not want to necessarily refer to the usual picture of Marianne because it was revolutionary, could have some connotations. And so the Parisienne became a new sort of happy icon that was not linked to any political parties or the idea of revolution, but more orientated towards commerce, the luxury goods which France wanted really to promote, including through Art Nouveau, because France decided that this was how they were going to mark the industrial world. So to go through the exhibition, you could go on the trottoir roulant. This was the moving pavement, which I think is great because it was movable by electricity. And people had never, ever experienced this before. So there were all these pictures and thoughts of how women would be falling off because it would be going so fast they wouldn't be able to go. So of course this idea, which is of course not so much what we'd want to see today, but at the time, I think it shows also the fascination people had for this. They're all smiling, they're all looking. So this trottoir roulant, why am I talking about it? Apart from the fact that I think it's really something that's quite fun, because it went all around the fair, including, which was quite lucky, past the Finnish pavilion, because the Finnish pavilion was on the second row, which means you wouldn't necessarily go past it on purpose if you were just walking about. But if you took this trottoir roulant, you could get off and have a good view of this Finnish pavilion, so it helped promote the pavilion. So and it had two speeds, so you could go on the slower speed or the faster speed, hence these quips about not being able to stay stable. And this is one more picture. Here you see the German pavilion with the Tour Eiffel on the back. And so I've integrated into the PowerPoint some pictures by Félix Vallotton, who made some caricatures about the Paris World Fair. If you had got to the trottoir roulant, you may have come to the fair in the metro. The Métropolitain, which is probably one of the most iconic Art Nouveau buildings or entrances of the world, designed by Hector Guimard. It was inaugurated for the World Fair. So the Paris Metro was built for this Metro World Fair, for the Paris World Fair. It wasn't finished when the fair opened, and one of the reasons was they couldn't decide on what sort of pavilions, what sort of entrances to have. They had all these projects, they didn't seem to satisfy, and then eventually Hector Guimard, who was an architect, proposed these sorts of very organic, very totally Art Nouveau buildings. And here you really see that they're inspired by shells, by organic forms. Here you can see how vegetables, have stems of flowers, have been reinterpreted. So this is something that was totally new, and it was the only Art Nouveau element of the fair that was officially commissioned by the fair. So anything else that was there was either a private enterprise or a foreign enterprise. So they had more than one of these pavilions that people would arrive at, and of course they created quite a stir, because even at the time people were not used to having buildings in the streets, so suddenly they had these entranceways, which also created horror amongst many critics, and people loathed them, and many people wanted them to be demolished, and so many of them ended up being demolished, and nowadays there are only a few left. So here's at the fair. As I was saying, you're not only looking at architecture. This is the first time, maybe in the previous fairs, industry, commerce would have been very important. They say that in 1900 we had arrived in the age of leisure. Suddenly, poorer people had more money, the middle class was growing, so actually people came who maybe would not have gone before. And for all these people, they were, and also thanks to electricity and all the modern inventions such as cinema and all these things, they created all these different sorts of animations for the public, who could go and see an explosion of the Vesuve, they could go on the new Ferris wheel, they could go and see an impression of being in a balloon and looking at the world, go to medieval festivals. I mean, there were so many of these things that when you read about them, you think, wow, it must have been incredible. And of course, for many people it was, because again, it was thanks to new techniques, new technology that hadn't been available up till then. But it also created something that people started saying, is this worth it? Do we need the World Fair anymore? Because now that pleasure and leisure is taking over and it's becoming like a big festival, do we need these World Fairs as they were anymore, which has huge, huge investments and take a lot of time. The Palais de l'Optique, which I thought was great, because it shows how in these crazy wooden and staff and plaster buildings, which were very ephemeral, you could have completely different sorts of installations. So you have an Art Nouveau poster, but if you look at the architecture, you wouldn't be able to say this is really Art Nouveau, but it's sort of pastiche of all different sorts. So there are many buildings which I'm not stopping on that have this sort of international fair, slightly rococo, slightly Art Nouveau, slightly completely fantastic appearance, and that's also what's considered to be the glitz of the fair. And I do think these are beautiful. They had all these different kiosks. Some of them were for newspaper stands, buying things. Again, not totally Art Nouveau, but this one would have a little bit. So it's sort of this fantastic world of beauty and of luxury. Now this is something very special. If you went through all these different places to enjoy yourself, there were many theaters, there were cinemas, and one of the theaters which had been built specifically was for Loie Fuller. She was an American dancer who had come to Paris and who had become really famous because she did her danse serpentine, or her luminous dances. So what Loie Fuller did, so this is a theater which in itself is very Art Nouveau, you see with the women with the flowing lines. The poster is very Art Nouveau, and I think it's very beautiful. And what was the most fascinating of all is that she invented this technique of dancing, which was considered to be the embodiment of Art Nouveau. If Art Nouveau became alive, this is what it would look like. She held these sticks and she had these, which she moved around like this. Apparently she wasn't actually such a good dancer. It was more what she could do with her hands and these crazy costumes which she had created. And the most important thing is that she saw the possibility of electricity. She patented, it was almost like an engineer, patented techniques of including lights into the show. So they'd have lights in her costumes, they'd have lights around, and all these lights would somehow make these crazy shapes appear, and they would change in color, they would change in quantity, and she became a muse for many artists of the time. Many of the most famous artists represented Loie Fuller in their sculptures or other elements because she really seemed to ignite something in people's minds, and the descriptions of her dances are really quite fabulous because of this movement and the light, which again, something people hadn't seen. And to me, this is the most interesting because it shows how Art Nouveau, if you really start getting into Art Nouveau, you can find Art Nouveau in basically every single aspect of life, because it became so popular, so international, and also so, what's the word I'm looking for, so polyvalent. It could just change it and adapt to whatever you wanted it. All right, now this is something that a topic I'm quite fond of. It's eating at the World Fair. Because again, in this idea of leisure and all these people coming to visit, people who maybe came to Paris for this one occasion, who would not normally do such a trip, you could go and eat in 3 different classes of restaurants: luxury, middle class, and sort of snacks. But this shocked the population of Paris. The bourgeois were not very happy about this because they suddenly ended up mingling with the poorer people. But it also brought these great commercial enterprises. So this is really personal people who were restaurateurs, who decided they wanted to have a stand at the pavilion. There were all sorts of these different kinds of restaurants. Of course, most of them were in the shape of a chalet for cheese or something like that. But the Pavillon Bleu is probably one of the most gorgeous restaurants at the time. And of course, totally Art Nouveau. René Dulon, who was a French architect, combined forces with Serrurier-Bovy, who did the interior decoration. Serrurier-Bovy was a very famous interior decorator from Belgium. And so people see it as like a Franco-Belge collaboration. And it's very much in this sort of French style with the flowing motifs. A little bit of Orientalism maybe, although Art Nouveau very often looked towards Japan or the Orient to get inspiration. And what I think is a gorgeous building, many critics hated. So one critic even said it looks like a beached whale that would have pulled its bones over its blubber and is just lying there, because they considered that these long arcs were like bones. And so there were these terrible criticisms, terrible reviews, but also wonderful ones. People who said, this is the most original, the most floral, the most innovateur. So again, many people do not agree at the time on what Art Nouveau is, on the value of Art Nouveau, and how you actually judge it. And probably the fact that this was a private enterprise added. Here's another picture, and the Pavillon Bleu means the blue pavilion. What I find odd is that it has these, so there are no photos, so we do not know what the colors were like, but the descriptions do say it was blue and yellow. This is taken from a menu, so it's the only picture we have in color. And the idea it gives me is that it was maybe a little bit garish, but the notions of color at the time were probably different from what we have today. So I think most people were quite impressed by the color. That does seem to come out in the comments. And certainly this meant that it was very visible. And of course, people say it was by the Tour Eiffel, it was by the pond, so you could easily sit there and enjoy life after having walked for a long time. And this is a fun one I discovered as I was preparing this PowerPoint. I hadn't seen this before. La belle meunière de cabaret, so the beautiful belle meunière, the beautiful flower grinder, owned by Marie Quinton, who was from Auvergne, where they had all these traditional costumes. So you have this building. This is what I find quite interesting, because this is very typical. You'd have a building which is not Art Nouveau per se. It's actually very traditional. It harks back to something very rustic, very localized. But they add, say, for example, at the bottom, openings that would actually be quite common in Helsinki, which have totally Art Nouveau shapes. So it's like a sort of a mixture, which is often what happens even today when you walk around in various cities. You can see a mixture, what we call eclecticism, And here it's very obvious, and again, how they adapted something. They wanted to make it modern, they wanted to make it attractive, and that's one of the reasons also why many of these private enterprises were more open to these new fashions, was because the official pavilions had to send in their plans, their projects, much earlier, before Art Nouveau really became popular. And then the private enterprises, who were more, they had more leeway, and so by the time they were proposing their projects, Art Nouveau had become more popular, and they knew there was a demand for it. They knew it, everybody liked it, and so they added it in little bits to their pavilions and showcases. They say that this, so here you see with the owner, I think it's the one at the top, and apparently there's like stories of how all the great people came to eat here and all these romances happened. She wrote a book after to say of what happened during the Exposition Universelle. This is one of the most famous places in the pavilion linked to Art Nouveau, because this is the Pavillon Bing. Siegfried Bing was probably the man who brought Art Nouveau to Paris. He was passionate about Japanism. He collected Japanese objects, and he then went to America, discovered Art Nouveau, met Art Nouveau artists, opened a pavilion, well, changed his shop that he had in Paris, filled it with amazing Art Nouveau ensemble, which were very pioneering. So he collected international Art Nouveau. But of course, another thing that I thought was quite interesting is that once again, when you see what was exhibited in his shop, you have all the more local, more close-by countries, but there's no Nordic Art Nouveau as far as I can tell. So again, two different worlds that are not yet really combining. But the Pavillon Bing, he had his own pavilion here in the Paris World Fair with these allegories of the arts. And today it seems like this is some of the photos that you'd see the most in pictures of the World Fair. So here you have the interiors. They were like, he asked specific decorators to decorate the ensemble. This was also a new way of showing furniture as, you know, the total work of art. Before, maybe you would have seen chairs, tables separately. There was this new idea that everything had to be harmonious. The Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, this idea that fine art and minor arts would no longer be separate. So fine arts, painting, sculpture would be mixed with pottery and iron making, and no longer make any distinction of hierarchy between the arts. And this was something totally new, which is also one of the fundamental values of Art Nouveau. And this is what you see here. There is like paintings, but there's also tapestry, there's also woodwork, there's silversmithing, coppersmithing, anything that could go together is gone together, and you show that, like, you create a bubble of beauty, of harmony. That was the idea of this total work of art, which could extend to the garden, it could extend to the facade, and here you see it in the Pavillon Bing. The classe de la parfumerie, so we've gone now to industry. I said I wouldn't talk about it very much, but this is, there are two sections I did want to mention, because this is showing how luxury industry is developing, especially perfume. It had first appeared in 1889 with the, I don't know how you say this in English, produit de synthèse. It means when you mix, you transform elements through chemical procedures, which would give way to modern day perfumes. So perfume industry was developing at this point, and 1900 was the first time the owners of various brands asked famous artists to design the pavilions, design the boxes, design the bottles, which again, this idea of the total work of art, but in a more commercial way. And I think it's very beautiful, and this is a topic I'm actually researching separately, because if you look at the various perfume stands and what happens at the time, here you have Hector Guimard, so who designs the metro entrances. Here he designs the whole display for the Maison Millot, for the brand Cantirix. And you have the Cantirix bottles at the back. You can still find them today on auction. And the idea again, put everything in a beautiful it's not so much here, I think, an aesthetic value. It's also, let's make it as good looking as we can so that people want to buy. And here you have some of the boxes. Packaging. Packaging was new at the time. Packaging enabled artists to decorate all these sides of the boxes. Publicity was also developing hugely at the time, so you have all these publicity posters and boxes and packaging and glass stickers. And of course, here you recognize the style of Alphonse Mucha, who seemed to be everywhere. When people had to design their stands, they all went running to Mucha so that he would do stuff for them. So Mucha really was omnipresent in this fair. And one funny industrial stand is the Heineken stand. You don't expect to see Art Nouveau and Heineken mixed together, but here it is. And the last industrial aspect I wanted to talk about was lalique, glass, ware and jewelry. Because lalique is one of the most famous glassware makers and jewelry designers. He designed these amazing Art Nouveau jewels, of which you have one very famous example here, where insects would transform into women, and they'd have all these. He wouldn't use traditional polished jewels. He'd used unpolished, more maybe second-rate, what was considered second-rate jewels. And of course, in this very, very luscious, floral, stylized Art Nouveau style. And it says that here you have an example of one of the bits that are on the banister. So he designed his whole pavilion as a total work of art. And they're like descriptions of how people would jostle and fight to see the lalique presentation, because this is what everybody was going to see. It was so popular. And Vallotton even made a caricature of these people. It's called lalique, because these are the people who are bustling and trying to fight to get to the front of the vitrine of René Lalique. Again, this is pinpointing how France wants to show their luxury industry, and Lalique very much in the forefront of this movement. And this is one way to go into the political side, because here you have Émile Gallet. Maybe Lalique and Gallet are the most famous designers, if you had to name two. And I think Gallet he was a glassware maker, and he was very political. He also made marquetry on furniture. And Gallet was from a family that came from Alsace-Lorraine. And as you know, when France lost to the Prussians in 1871, they had to cede Alsace and part of Lorraine to Prussia. And the people who lived in the area that was given to Germany had to choose either to become German or to leave. And so many people left, moved into the neighboring Lorraine near Nancy. Nancy became a huge hub for industry, art, culture, because all these people brought their knowledge and their professions with them. And Gallet came from a family of verriers, of glassmakers, who moved to Nancy. And Gallet, for all his working life, lived in the dream that Alsace-Lorraine would be returned to France. This is something very strong in French ideology, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. So we're talking about politics. This was very much present in various artists such as Gallet. But Gallet wasn't only based on this topic. He also took various stances, and not especially the Dreyfus affair. I suppose you're familiar with this. It's something that just rocketed through the everyday life of every single French person when Dreyfus, who was an officer, was accused of being a traitor in the army. And basically he was accused, they chose him because he was Jewish. And he was sent off to prison on an island for many years, and it was totally unfair because he was innocent. And it was a totally false accusation. They fabricated proof, all sorts of things, and it just divided the French population by the pros and the anti-Dreyfus. And why am I talking about this is that it got to the point where it was such an international conflict, it became such a topic that many nations were saying, we're going to boycott the Paris 1900 fair because we cannot come to a place where you have accused this man, and we think he's not a culprit. And because they were so worried about cancelling the fair and places not coming, in the end they pardoned Dreyfus in 1899. Pardon is not saying he's innocent, and it took until 1906 until he was finally declared innocent. And anyway, but they chose to pardon him so that the pavilions would come to the fair. And this is also interesting for Finland, because Finland also had this discussion, will we go, will we participate? But the problem was, for Finland, they needed to come to the fair because it was important at the time for them to be able to promote their national identity, to what they were fighting for, how to become their own nation. And so in the end, as some other countries, they decided that their interests, their needs, were more important, and they would come to the fair. So finally the problem was eradicated because he was pardoned, and here you have Les Hommes Noirs, which is one of these most famous vases by Gallet. You see it's Art Nouveau. It has these flowers, but it's very dark, very black, and it represents the black men, les hommes noirs. So the black men are considered by Gallet to be the judges, military men, priests, all these people who were against Dreyfus. And Gallet used to write sentences on many of his works. The question is, black men, where do you come from? And at the bottom of the vase it says, we come from under the earth. And it was lyrics from a song, a very patriotic and a revolutionary song, so it shows political engagement. I'm quite interested in this topic also because, as we were saying, if we get to the political side of Art Nouveau, here it is. He also had vases with flowers and beautiful elements that had nothing to do with anything nationalistic, but here we have Gallet being a nationalist, but also a very vocal defender of Dreyfus, for which he actually was going to lose a lot of customers. So I think you all recognize this, the Finnish pavilion, which was a very beautiful and unusual pavilion in the scope of the fair. It was quite small. It looks like a church. It was on the second row, close to the Norwegian pavilion, I think. And there was I'm not an expert on Finnish architecture, so I hope, I'm sure there are people who are more competent than I am. But what I was interested in is what does it look like compared to the previous pavilion? Because in Finland, the Finnish people had sent a pavilion to the 1889 fair, which looked like this. Much more wooden, much more traditional. Of course, this is quite a few years earlier. In the meantime, national romanticism had started to develop. This idea at the end of the 19th century, what is Finnish identity, linked to this idea of promoting Finnish language, of promoting Finnish identity, of sort of going against Russification and creating an independent state, ultimately, was all happening at this time. And this question, what is our identity, is something that was not happening so much in countries like France and Belgium, where Art Nouveau was so proeminent, but it was happening in many of the other countries in the North and in Eastern Europe. So it's like a belt of countries, which is quite fascinating for people like me who've mainly studied previously more French and Belgian Art Nouveau, to suddenly discover that there's this whole other side of it. And the pavilion of Finland was the most Art Nouveau at the time. I find it hard to understand why some other nations didn't do it, because I'm sure if Finland managed, others would surely have managed as well. So there's of course many different possibilities of explanations. One is that Finland hadn't actually planned until quite late to get their own pavilion. They had to get authorization from the Tsar to do it. Many Russian authorities did not want Finland to have their own pavilion. They'd been able to have their own pavilion in 1889 because Russia had not participated in the World Fair because they were at odds with France, so they'd sort of boycotted it. And that was what enabled Finland to have their own pavilion the first time. Here it's a different context because France and Russia were become allies again. But Finland managed to get their own pavilion. And they had a competition, and the winners of the competition were the young architects Gazelius, Saarinen and Lindgren, who we saw before with the Pohjola building. They had been building this Pohjola building. They were starting to get up and coming. And of course, this is very much what put them on the map. After this creation, which gave them international fame and brought attention to them, and it managed to bring attention of everybody onto Finland, it really was what launched their careers and which could enable them afterwards to go on to build many more buildings in Helsinki and in other places that would be total works of art, an expression of national romanticism and of what Finland, or Finnish identity, is. I was interested in reading Art et Décoration. Art et Décoration was a review that was published monthly in Paris. It was like the Bible of art and ornamentation at the time. And it's very interesting that when the expo opened, the first article they write about any pavilion is about the Finnish pavilion, which is not something I would have expected necessarily. First they had two articles that were more general about porcelain and about glassware, and which were French industries. And then suddenly you have a whole article about the Finnish pavilion, and then when I look through the following issues, there are hardly any more. So it's one of the only real descriptions of the pavilion that this hugely read journal did. And I hope it's not, I'm losing track of the time, but I would like to read you a little translation I've written, because I thought this is something that shows how people saw this Finnish architecture and how they considered it. Because remember, there's always this idea of we want to find a new style, get rid of the old, find something purely national, purely authentic, purely going back to what we are and not recuperating examples from the past. So here we go. It's written by A. Barthélemy, and he writes, this is of course in a tone very typical of 1900. At the Exposition Universelle, there is on the Rue des Nations a small pavilion which, being on the second row, which means not directly over the Seine, it suffers from a sort of disdain from many visitors. It is the Finnish pavilion. But for the tranquil and thoughtful visitor who wishes to judge architecture not by the flattering attention given to them by illustrated postcards, nor by the accumulation of golden domes, the Finnish pavilion is one of the most seductive, one of the most deeply interesting constructions of the whole exhibition. The general character has been chosen with care, as well as the details of the ornamentation. They are chosen by a spirit very characteristic of a race and a milieu. This idea of race, of course, at the time, very important, comes back, including for Mucha. We saw so many of Mucha's designs. Mucha was considered a foreign artist. He was from the Czech Republic, and comments in the various reviews say he has always stayed loyal to his race. So people really do see this idea of the country. He goes on, we are definitely in the presence of a specific national art, and yet it is nevertheless a new work of art that we have before us. The architects did not limit themselves to seeking inspiration in elements of local architecture that they have before their eyes in their own country, which would lead to a construction of a very general character. Here, the Finns can recognize themselves in the work that has been accomplished, but there is also a show of individual character. We already knew which was the artistic and the intellectual vitality of the people of Finland. We already are familiar with the work of Edelfelt, Wallgren, Stigel, who have for a long time been among us. Their stay with us has not altered their personality, and we still feel that they are fed with the legendary poems and mysterious landscapes which have molded the soul of all those who inhabit their land. This character is powerfully on show in all the decorative and architectural ensemble of the Finnish pavilion. This curious union of roughness and tenderness among a people that has maintained in all sincerity something primitive, thanks to the hardships of the climate, the battles that they have had to face, and as well because of the persistency of national legends. This reference to being primitive, of course, today sounds very pejorative, negative, but actually at the time it didn't mean this, because there was, it might be slightly condescending, of course, but this was what they were in search of. At the time, people were tired, mass production, industrialization, machines. There was this idea to go back to a more natural state, and people would go in search of primitive lands, which were considered to be lands where industry, commerce, and capitalism hadn't taken over. And so we find these sorts of definitions applied to Finland, but maybe to Hungary. There are quite a few articles about the Hungarian pavilion where they talk about barbarians. And again, it's quite shocking. And at the same time, you realize that they're talking about something that is also admired. So we could debate about that. I won't go too much into it, but there is something deeply admired in this, what they consider to be something really authentic. That's probably what it comes down to, it's authenticity. So I'm sure you know these pictures, but just to show a little bit. The interior, which is very much like a church. And these canons have also influenced, I'm sure, most of Helsinki architecture of the time. It was what was being constructed at the time, this common decision, common thought, common reflection about what is our national style. Akseli Gallen-Kallela, who painted the frescoes at the top, and there were other paintings by Edelfelt. In the middle there was a meteorite that had fallen in Porvoo, which had been put in this special case. And so when people came in, they had this feeling that they were entering a church, something very serene, made of this presence of stone, which was also something that was very much part of the discussion, the rough stone, the natural stone. It was all part of this idea of authentic construction and architecture. And of course, to show off, as most pavilions, sort of local activities. It was quite cultural. This was the press stand, so you see it's very Art Nouveau. And people here could come and get the guidebook to the pavilion. And they had placed various publications that were in French to try and promote what is Finland. History of Finland, the Grand Duchy of Finland. These books were made available to anybody who was interested to promote the cause. Let's not forget that if you have a battle or a fight for independence or autonomy or whatever, it's very important not only to get on board the people of your country, it's maybe even more important to get on board other countries. Recognition, international recognition helps get attention and helps you in the end. So this is, of course, what is sought by Finland. It's to get this international recognition, to get people behind Finnish people in that, so that they would have support. And that's very much what happened. I didn't manage to find any specific descriptions where I could actually verify it, but there are many comments on people who've written articles who say this was not lost on anybody. Anybody who visited the Finnish pavilion understood what the message was. So I would be quite happy to find a text where I can actually see that, but in the meantime, if anybody knows one, I'd be quite happy. But in the meantime, I think this is also something for us. When we look at these pictures, we probably do not understand everything that's behind it, but people at the time apparently did. So I'll quickly go on here, the iris room, the decoration. So you see very heavy, very massive architecture. The iris room, of course, Iris being a very local, beautiful brand of pottery and ceramics and glass. And this is interesting because this is one of the first things I was told when I came to Finland. The pavilion finlandais. It had section russe, Russian section, pavillon finlandais. And apparently in many of the postcards, publicity and other things, Finland scratched off the Russian section. So you'd end up with pictures like that, where you could just see pavillon finlandais, Finnish pavilion, and the Russian section has disappeared. And apparently this was really quite common, so it's sort of like photoshopping. And it was the same thing for the double eagle of the Russian eagle, which apparently was also, I couldn't find any examples, so most of the pictures I saw still had it, but apparently the eagle was erased off many postcards. So also this way of showing we are not so much part of Russia. We want to be separate. We are our own entity. And I think so these are the elements that I wanted to be sure I talked about, and I think it's done. And so we could go on to some other, I'm just looking at the time. I'll go quite quickly now. So here you have Germany. So this is, you see how traditional Germany's pavilion was. Germany was really wanting to be at the forefront. They made a huge investment for this Paris fair, and much of it was very traditional, but again, they wanted to show that they were at the forefront of art, so they also designed quite a bit of Art Nouveau for their restaurant. And that's a way some of them managed to get off with it, is that if they didn't have Art Nouveau in their main pavilion, they would add it to a restaurant, to a kiosk, to a smaller building, like an annex, which would be a way of somehow making it accessible. I think Austria is, because you can sort of compare the issue of Russia versus Finland, with Austria and Austria-Hungary, with this huge empire combined of many, many different ethnic groups who are all sort of huddled into this empire. And Austria had this huge problem in that they couldn't anymore keep them all, they couldn't keep them quiet because nationalism was mounting in all countries. People were sort of grumbling, wanting more autonomy, wanting independence. And Austria had to, in their point of view, they sort of had to find a way to keep all these grumbling ethnicities in one huge empire. And for Austria, Art Nouveau became a means of doing this, because in smaller parts of the empire, they developed their own very specific Art Nouveau, and Austria had this, Austria, especially Vienna, had this very high-fashioned, artistic, very beautiful and sort of just aesthetic Art Nouveau that didn't have as much political innuendo, and they really used Art Nouveau a lot. So again, Mucha has been hired to design catalogs, menus, whatnot. This is Joseph Hoffmann, who was one of the most famous designers at the time. He was a professor at the school. He really designed very beautiful, very sober architecture. Here it's not as sober. He designed this interior for the Decorative Arts and Furnishing Center. And when you look at it again, you see this is all, it's not so much national. This is very international, you could say. Here is again some Joseph Ulbrich, another big name, Viennese interior, beautiful wooden work, beautiful sculpture. So this is again this idea of the ensemble. And why do I think it's important to show those pictures is because you have Hungary. Hungary at the time had been sort of, it's the dual monarchy. Hungary had this sort of tension with Austria. They were part of this huge empire. They had gained more autonomy from Austria in the 1860s, but still, they're always fearful of what Austria might do. They do not want to, they don't want to be taken over, and so they're always trying to get international attention, trying to show that they're their own community, that they have their own culture, that they have their own art, that they are a completely different entity, and it's very important, again, for Austria, as it was with Finland, to have this international recognition. So you'd have these pavilions. So Hungary had its own pavilion, but of course, when you had the public exhibitions, because you had your pavilions, but then you had all these different exhibitions in other parts of the fair, whether it would be furniture, fine art, whatever. And for example, here, you see how you'd go from Austria to Hungary, and most people didn't necessarily know the difference. And so Hungary really tried to show, you see the arch that's there, you see the difference in style. It's much more ornamental, it's much more maybe a bit oriental, and they really want to show they're different. And they had this carpet, which was designed by Mucha, which was supposed to sort of show this transition. You see this carpet, which is full of, it's quite imaginary, it's not actually referencing to anything in particular, but it's very full of ornamental, oriental sides, because Hungary didn't really know where the Magyar culture came from. They were trying to find the roots the Magyar people. The Magyar were the biggest community in Hungary, and they were trying to prove that they came really from the Orient, from India or such countries, because this way it would have really shown that they were not part of Austria, they were not part of the Occident, they were different. And so this idea of showing an Oriental side, which has been put into Art Nouveau, is quite common in various countries of this Eastern European band of countries. And I find it really quite fascinating because people, in the critics, when people write about it, they'll give great comments about Austria, how wonderful it is, and they'll say nothing about Hungary. It's almost like it doesn't exist. Or they'll be like, oh, this barbarian, blah, 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 blah. Very interesting, quite folkloric. So there is interest, but it's not huge interest. And yet Hungary really goes out of its way. They've put in place all sorts of ideas to recreate handicrafts, folklore motif, go back to the peasant productions to get motifs and recreate things that were more of the people. And that's what they tried to show in their different displays. So here you have the Hungary. What I like very much is you see all these stylized patterns which have been taken from embroideries, that's what happened in many countries. In all these countries that were trying to show their own identity, most of them went back to peasant folklore, peasant traditions, including embroidery. That's happened very much here. When people went to Karelia to find artifacts, they brought back embroideries and took back the motifs. So many of these motifs that you find in Hungarian architecture, Art Nouveau, have been taken and inspired by folkloric motifs. And here is the entrance to the exhibit of Hungarian textiles and cottage industries, because this is also how many of these smaller countries or sort of minority countries tried to promote their local industries by getting, it's sort of odd because they would get money from the Austrian government to create local handicraft schools, which means that on one hand you'd have sort of Austria keeping an eye and making sure that the motifs would be sort of commercial, maybe try and get them to be as harmonious as possible throughout the empire, but at the same time you have individual efforts, some artists that really go out of their way to create specific Hungarian motifs. This is some of the pictures that were very criticized. Most critics said, we applaud the effort, we see what Hungary is trying to do, but they haven't got to the refined aspect of Viennese Art Nouveau. But technically that's probably not really what Hungary was trying to do, because Hungary was trying to show that they were different, and critics were quite disparaging of this Hungarian ornament. There were some who liked it very much. But what is interesting is apparently that Austria, after the World Fair, decided to integrate into their own Austrian Viennese style elements of Hungarian Art Nouveau. So it's always changing, and there's always some political situation, context that you could read into there. And this is just to show you how physically it's also interesting. It would be like, say, the Finnish pavilion and the Russian pavilion, but here it would be Hungary, Bosnia, Austria. So Austria and Hungary are separated. They're not next to each other. They're separated by Bosnia, which was also in the empire, but what had less of a political movement. But it's also quite interesting. I like this because Muha, I don't know that much about this Bosnian pavilion. I don't think the national side was so huge, but Muha, who's everywhere, was hired to decorate the interior. So you have this sort of traditional Bosnian outside, exterior. They've added some elements of decoration, but inside, Muha went and decorated with these beautiful Art Nouveau friezes, stylized friezes, and of depictions of historical aspects of the story of Bosnia. So by reminding people of the history, of the past, the common past of certain countries, including countries that had been divided, it was a way of reminding people that these are different groups, different nations who have now been integrated into empires and who may want to be free from them. And what I also like very much is that to create these frescoes, Muha actually went to he went to travel through Bosnia, and this is where he saw rural vernacular architecture, rural artifacts, and he really discovered this side of things that he would after become passionate about. He would actually leave Paris in the end to go back to what was going to become the Czech Republic, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting for the independence of the Slav movement. So he really became a fervent nationalist, and it started with his trip to Bosnia, when he was after able to integrate into all his various pictures elements of folklore tradition from Eastern Europe. And here is Bosnia offering her products of the World Fair, and you see he's integrated the costumes, the activities of the peasants. This is something that would be omnipresent all throughout Eastern Europe. So one of my almost last pictures, this is the German pavilion. I've hardly spoken about Germany, whereas they invested so much money to show how important they were. And I actually didn't find that many pictures, but I do like this picture of the Weinstube. Here you have, I put this other picture so that you could see the sort of official rooms, the Imperial Pavilion. And again, you have the restaurant. A restaurant is a good way to put traditional, stick your Art Nouveau in the restaurant. So you see you have all these stylized grape motifs. There's like references to the local tradition of winemaking, and it was quite popular. And here is the Norwegian pavilion, which is a good example also. The pavilion actually is not that Art Nouveau at all. So I'm going to go quite quickly. You see the Finnish pavilion in the background with the double-headed eagle. This is the interior, also nothing Art Nouveau, very much showing fishing, whatnot, hunting. But in other sections of the displays, they showed these sorts of tapestries. Tapestries were considered to be a very local, very traditional way of local handicrafts. Frida Hansen, a very interesting artist, who went and found these disappearing tapestry making techniques. She made them, she sort of revived them, created workshops, tried to give work to women who would become knowledgeable in these old, historical, centuries-old way of making tapestries. And initially, she was sort of looking into sagas and more Norwegian themes. And then she sort of went traveling and discovered more European motifs. So here you have the Milky Way, which was presented in 1900, which was awarded with a gold medal. And I do love this very much. And she herself did not consider herself as a representative of Norwegian art. Today, she's sort of put in the mixture of Norwegian artists of the time who were promoting Norwegian identity. But of course, the one who was considered to be the most famous artist and the real representative of Norwegian identity is Gerhard Munther, and here his beautiful Daughters of the Northern Lights, which is also called the Suitors. And this is extremely Art Nouveau. What do you have here? You have stylization, you have lack of, everything's on the same plan, there's no depth. You have nature, you have animals, you see the hair of the daughters, how it's stylized, and it's showing fear. And this tale, why is it so Norwegian, is that it takes motifs from Viking ships, and it's very much inspired by the sagas, these old tales that tell the tales of the Norse and the kings of ancient times. And this is a tale of a bear king who comes to claim a bride, and he's supposed to be awarded a bride, but the king tries to cheat him. So the bear comes 3 times to knock, and each time takes back a different daughter, each time realizes it's the one he didn't want, and so he comes back. So what's interesting is that here you have this picture where the Munther has managed to put everything into one picture. Different scenes of the story have been put into one. And there is like a candle. When the candle is supposed to give you an idea of what comes after in the story. The story being that at night the bear becomes a prince, but nobody will ever know because nobody can see him at night. So this is an old tale, and there are other tapestries like this. So there's a whole series that Munthe displayed. He also got a gold medal. So suddenly you had Frida Hansen and Gerhard Munthe, these two Norwegian artists who were promoted to the forefront, but Munthe in Norway, which was still under Sweden until 1905, I think. So they were also questioning what is our identity. And whereas, for example, in Finland you have more this idea of the Kalevala, which is a national epic that was made and constructed, put together in the 19th century, here you have the similar idea of going back to the sagas, but also the spirits that populate the forests is very strong in Norwegian Art Nouveau. So this is also Art Nouveau that I'd never really discovered at all until I started researching this sort of topic. And just because I thought you might be curious to see the Swedish pavilion, which is not Art Nouveau, but so Norway was still part of Sweden. This was actually considered quite modern. It's not Art Nouveau at all, but it's all linked to boats. So there were towers, pontoons, you could walk around. So it was actually considered to be quite a modern building that people liked very much. But I'm not going to dwell on it because it's not Art Nouveau. And this is my last topic, which I wondered whether I would discuss that much. The pavilion of Russia, which of course I think is interesting also because we talked about the Finnish pavilion. You see, the Finnish pavilion they were so intent on showing that they were not Russian. That's one of the reasons why they chose not to have a wooden pavilion, because they were scared that people would not see the difference between Finnish and Russian wooden architecture. So that's why you have this granite building. And here you have the imperial Russian palace. But Russia has a different problem. Similar to Austria, perhaps, Russia has this huge empire, which had grown so much at the end of the 19th century. And their problem was, how do we give a common identity to this gigantic empire that has so many different groups in it? And Russia sort of became a bit trapped by the way it promoted itself, because not only did it have to create some common ideal of what was Russian within Russia, but then they had to promote Russia to the Occident, and they wanted to show that they were Occidental, but then they realized that if they showed themselves as Occidental, Europeans were not actually interested. They wanted to see fantasy, they wanted to see something exotic, and so Russia had a bit of a problem portraying itself, and in the end always had to sort of go back to these very traditional, very deeply sort of exotic pavilions which people loved to visit. They were very popular. But what I do like about Russian Art Nouveau, if you take away the politics, is that they as well favorized handicrafts, going back to basics. And this was a way of saying, we'll share handicrafts, and this idea will go throughout the land. And it really did work. And you have these very beautiful, very, very traditional motifs. There's a lot more that you could show for Russia. Russian Art Nouveau is not very studied because all the sources, of course, are not in languages that most researchers can check out. But it's actually a topic that I would like to look into much more because it's quite fascinating. And this mixture of how you show yourself to the Occident and how you show yourself to your own country, which I think is something that has been part of most Art Nouveau endeavors, because whatever Art Nouveau movement you have, whatever the country, whether it be Finland, Norway, any country you choose, yes, there is this idea of showing who you are, showing your identity through architecture, through handicrafts, through artifacts, but at the same time, you're fully aware that you're part of an international movement. Whatever you're doing you know that this is what is happening in the other countries. So by being yourself, you are actually part of a whole. And so not only are you fighting for your own existence, but you are fighting also for a universal harmony. So I think after all this talking, you could go and have a coffee in the Salon Bleu. This is Valaton showing all the visitors who must be very tired at 5 o'clock. This is called 5 o'clock. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them.
Thank you, Marikit, for your flamboyant wonderful lecture. And please, if you have any questions or points you want to ask Marikit, please do so. I was wondering myself, for how many months did the expo last?
For 6 months. 6 months, and actually the Finnish pavilion was one of the only pavilions that was ready and open at the opening of the foire. The Pavillon Bleu, for example, his owner actually tried to get money from the government. He was complaining that for the first few months of since he opened, there were road works and that things were not finished, and so he lost out on a lot of money. So I think this is something you often find in these world international fairs. Not all the countries are at the same time ready, but apparently Finland put together their pavilion very fast because they decided quite late to have their own pavilion. And then the plans were made, they had the competition, they had various competitions, and it was done. And apparently all kinds of stonemasons and workers were brought over from Finland to build the pavilion.
So what happened to the pavilions after 6 months? I mean, did they save any?
They didn't save any. There are some small bits that are here and there, but that's the whole interesting or sad thing about the pavilions, is that they're made to be ephemeral. So in one side, that means you have freedom to create something new, something a little bit challenging, but on the other hand, it means it all disappears, and that's something crazy about these fairs. And that's like, if I could go back in time, I would definitely choose to go to the Paris, the Exposition Universelle, because I'd love to see some of these pavilions. And there are like very small bits that are here and there. There's one kiosk that is kept in France. Some little bits have been sent here and there, but in general, nothing was made to be kept. Which is also why they call them, like in some critics would say, it's a world of plaster and wood. Nothing is solid. It's all cladding. It's all temporary, so nothing is actually, symbolically, nothing is reliable.
And what part of Paris this was on? Was it east side? West side?
It's really in the center where in the middle where the Seine is, where the Concorde, the Place de la Concorde, and so it's really in the center. And of course, it brought 50 million people, but actually they lost quite a lot of money in the end because it was so over the top. The government did lose out. But I think it won in the end because today nobody knows anything about other international World's Fair. We know maybe about the first one, which was in 1851 in England, especially because we know or we've heard of the Crystal Palace. That was the first one. But this one has marked history. If you're interested in Art Nouveau, you can't avoid it. And if you're interested in all kinds of other topics, you can't avoid it. So it's the only one that actually did stay and mark history. So I think whatever Paris did, whether people liked it or not, it has definitely left a long-lasting mark. Thank you.